kiddo. If you see the lesser amount, the 2.47%, then you'll know that's a child who's eligible under CHIP. So that's how the FMAP works. It's updated annually, and it's available on the website. The reimbursement for school-based health services, accordingly with our state plan, is all cost-based. We tied into ODE's requirement for all school districts to submit their prior year audited costs by December 31st annually, to go through that process, and then also you can apply for your ODE approved indirect rate for those costs, and from that is how you will develop the hourly cost rate for the category of service that you will bill Medicaid for your children eligible under IDEA with OT, PT, speech, nursing services. So each area of service will have its own cost, and it's unique to each school district based on prior year actuals and your current year indirect rate. The intent for the pilot project, reimbursement funds to support school health services. And this does not include school-based health centers. School-based health centers are public health clinics. Basically, they fall under the jurisdictional rules and regulations of public health. They are not under the authority of public education's rules and regulations. So that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're having these conversations. And if you note at the top of this, even though it says school-based health services, it says SHS, school health services. School health services is a term that can be either, which is you need to be careful when you are listening to the services being discussed or discussing the services, so that you can delineate the public health school-based centers services that are being provided versus the school-based health services that are IDEA services. Mm-hmm. So the Medicaid School-Based Health Services State Plan is approved by the federal government for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We've identified school-based health services eligible for reimbursement under the plan as OT, PT, nurse services, etc. Our costs are also, the cost and payment methodology is also in the School-Based Health Services State Plan Amendment. The services are billed for IDEA services pursuant to the Social Security Act at 1903C that makes Medicaid first payer for these services. And so that aligns with the 34 CFR 30154 down below that says it's a requirement for the Memorandum of Understanding between ODE, DHS, and OHA. So that is for Medicaid to be first payer for services provided to children with disabilities, for them to have access to and benefit from their free and appropriate public education. And under the plan, it would be those Medicaid eligible children, albeit IDEA provides services to all children. Medicaid will only pay for services to Medicaid eligible children. This is a list of the qualified medical school-based health services licensed staff. Certified occupational therapist assistants, delegated healthcare who are unlicensed individuals trained by an RN to perform nursing tasks based on the RN's judgment, licensed clinical social workers, licensed practical nurse LPNs, licensed physical therapist assistants, physical therapists, occupational therapists, registered nurses, specialized transportation adapted to serve the needs of a disabled child, when it is on their IEP, and only on the days that the child receives a covered health-related service such as OT, PT, or speech that is also specified on the child's IEP can be reimbursed. So transportation is always billed separately to ensure that the health service is reimbursed first. And then you will see when you're billing for high needs kids or, you know, nurse services with delegated health care, that the transportation really adds up because it qualifies services reimbursed on a daily basis for those kiddos receiving services on a daily basis under nurses. And then you have speech language therapy and their SLPA assistants. We have this. This is our Medicaid eligible percentages for kiddos that are school age. And so we pulled the data by county, and this is what's used in our MAC program, the Medicaid Administrative Claiming Program, to help with getting those percentages needed in order to claim Medicaid administrative activities. And that's compared with ODEs, ADMs by county. And you can see with the economy, we have a lot of Medicaid eligible children in Oregon. The total funds paid by school-based health services providers, actually, this is an older chart that Eli pulled, but we actually do this now by modifier so that we can tell you the total amount of services billed in each area of service. So the purpose of the pilot is to not only bill and get on board with billing Medicaid, but then to maximize those services that are available to be billed to Medicaid. And so we can split out the services by psychological, speech, OT, PT, RN, LPN, transportation, audiology, and show the dollars amount that were paid by state fiscal year. And I have that information that I gave earlier to Eli that he can also provide to you for the state fiscal year 2014-15, 15-16, and 16-17. And there's a key for the modifiers on there as well so that it'll identify the services for you. This is really good data for how services will be tracked to show that they're being maximized, because your IDEA services will go into ORMED's data capture system, and all of the services that are Medicaid eligible that are submitted to us for reimbursement will be validated against a Medicaid eligible child's IEP. So having that information coupled with the Medicaid billing, we'll be able to discern the amount of services billed by each of the pilot districts and the maximization of the billing.
This is the current 2016-17 the most recent data from 2016-17 fiscal year, as was mentioned, broken out by what service by service.
And I think a good thing to note here is what we're showing you is what was paid. Okay, because school districts have had up to 12 months to bill a service, this is not delineated by date of service. I believe for the pilot project, and because you need it to align with an IEP and the state fiscal year, it's going to have to align with date of service. so that we keep apples to apples in these comparisons as we go through this pilot.
So one of the presentations that we made to the legislature, and I think is important for folks to digest all this information that we just provided, is that we looked at looked at a couple of case studies of district billing. One of which that I'm showing here today is a school district, roughly 3,700 students total. They start off by identified who was Medicaid eligible, IDEA eligible, and again, services must be supported on the child's IEP and are specific to the child. This district identified 15 of the highest need students. They were primarily nursing dependent or medically fragile students. And as Linda mentioned before, often those students also have other services that can be billed for example, transportation, speech, etc. They provided FTE, a small portion of an FTE of administrative oversight. They established their state funds match account and established a committee. I believe it was a committee that was already practicing around school wellness and health, but that committee took on the responsibility of use of funds, or at least a portion of the funds. That increased, ensured that they were spent on health-related services and or supplies, but also brought a level of transparency for stakeholders, both internal to the district and external in the community. So with those 15 highest need students, the school-based health service claiming, they chose to start off with nursing, transportation, and delegated nursing services. They also participated in the MAC claiming. After the second year, this data, they were able to claim an estimated 300,000 school-based health service dollars, as well as just over 200,000 in MAC. This was directly put back into their health services program. And you can see what some of the examples of what the money went to increase the services, both for their students, but as well as for the health service, the licensed health service personnel providing services to those students. So they got increased supplies, first aid kits, additional professional development money, and so on.
Is the claimed 300,000 and the 210 MAC, is that total?
Total.
Okay, so that's total state share and federal share.
I believe so, correct.
So for those of you listening that aren't familiar with MAC, it is a 50-50 match. So 50% of those funds of the 210,000, 105, would have been the funds they were able to get. And then, of course, on the 300,000, if you go by the FMAP that we were talking about, then that would give you the federal share portion for that. If you just say along a 60-40 split, it's the easiest way to look at it.
And as Linda says it, I believe, and I'll double check, but I believe I took that the match out of that to represent the money that was actually brought back into the school in form of reimbursement.
Okay, so we want to clarify and make sure that we have that in this when we present.
And the reason I remember that is one of the legislators asked the same question. So I believe correct, but I will double check. So some of the concerns as we've been talking to districts that have come up, the complexity of billing process. There's nothing, I think, quicker than to get someone's eyes to glaze over than to start talking sometimes about Medicaid. And so the word Medicaid and the complexity of it, both the federal and I think state processes, at least perhaps historically or by reputation, are complex, or in reality complex. Again, one of the goals of the pilot project is to ease some of this for school districts.
And I want to say something about that on the complexity of the billing process, because even ODE acknowledged years and years ago, this really was very complex and difficult. But the Oregon Health Authority made changes to our MMIS data capture system to actually calculate the state share for you for the claims for each child billed, so that you know what the state share amount is that you will pay before we pull down the federal share fund. And it works like a checkbook. It'll show you the balance in your account. It'll show you how much money we took for the state share. We combine it with the federal share to equal total payment to you for those services. Before, years ago, all of this was done manually. So now it's all fully automated, and so I think that makes a huge difference.
And so I think part of what Linda just said also addressed the second concern around upfront funding for the district account. Now that it's automated, it's much more quick, and you can see up front again on what match is needed, and can deposit or provide that match funding as needed to receive the federal funds. There's concern around increased school staff time required for billing and documentation. We hear this both from those who are medically licensed and providing the health services in the schools, as well as a concern at the business office level. There is a little bit of an upfront investment or capacity building needed for getting on board, but a lot of that increased cost, and we'll touch on this a little bit again, but that gets calculated back into the cost that your prior annual audited cost that goes into calculating your the cost of providing the service that you're reimbursed on.
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly a fear or concern, I think, and for some of doing it wrong and not having and not doing it in a malicious sense, but not knowing and not knowing, maybe doing something wrong and facing a federal audit and findings. And that, I would say, is the primary reason and goal for ODE and OHA and ORMED is to support districts to feel more comfortable around that and to answer questions quickly, accurately, and to support them in billing.
And I also want to say, too, that the fear of federal audit findings, and especially when it says sanctions, I'm sure a lot of this stems from school districts from years past when there were findings for fraud, and they were transportation. Eagle Point, and yes, I mean, there were two different areas. Well, it was public record. But the deal is this. We just did a school-based health services review, and we found errors. You will make errors. Errors and fraud are not the same. And we believe school districts are always trying and wanting to do the right thing. So I'm not really particularly worried about sanctions and those sort of things. I think we have come together with the rules, with a better understanding, with the way the services are calculated and processed, and doing the costs, et cetera, that if there's an error and you find an error, all you have to do is bring it forward. We'll help you to fix it, and we'll move on. We don't look at an error as fraud and abuse. And when you find those errors and report them, and we've had several school districts report errors, and MESD has helped with some of those for costs, for example. Oh, I forgot, I didn't give you the right cost, or I was off by a few cents, or that kind of thing. Then we move forward to fix it. We correct it, we fix it, we move forward. That is not going to trigger an audit, findings, and sanctions.
Thank you. The other part of one of the concerns we've heard is it's just not worth it. It's not worth the time and energy. I think this relates to some of what Linda spoke about as far as how we've streamlined the process, or how OHA has, and how ODE and OHA are partnering with ORMED to provide some additional support. However, this is what the report is to the legislature. So part of this pilot project is to see if there is a threshold of cost benefit to where it wouldn't be necessarily beneficial. As we're looking, and especially when we're looking at targeted billing and the demographics that you have in your district, we believe that it's going to be beneficial. Another concern we've heard is parent consent. Like I said before, a parent must consent to billing and their child's benefits. This can prevent billing and may be a barrier. However, also having a good understanding of and being able to communicate what a parent is consenting to and what the purpose of that is, it will likely help in most, if not all cases.
I think it's also important to note for parent consent that a lot of the issues stemmed from the CCOs and the managed care organizations that were thinking that if a child was receiving the services in the school, then they would not be allowed to, it would impact their benefit in the community setting. And that was brought to our attention by parents through ESDs and districts. We move forward to correct that. School-based health services, IDEA services, are a carve-out from managed care and the care coordination organizations. They may not deny services simply because a child is receiving a service in the school setting for on a plan under the IDEA. So we put that in rule, and it's not a concern anymore. I do know that there has been a lot in the rumor mill over the years, and that's one of the withholds that parents have. But if you know that and you have the rule and you can provide them with a copy of the language, I think it will help assure them that it will not impact their child's benefit outside the school settings.
And then the last primary concern that we've heard is, and we know, and it's what brought us to the pilot project, is the high caseloads for school nurses and other medically licensed staff. And ultimately, the chicken egg conundrum of not having enough staff, having staff with too high a caseload, and asking to do just a little bit more. Our work with, in partnership with OHA and ORMED, we hope to alleviate a lot of any extra work and duplication of tasks, but also have heard that it's really, it really becomes important on communicating to staff and showing the benefits of billing Medicaid in the form of additional support, whether it be FTE, supplies, professional development, and those kind of things. And so we've built that in as well, but do acknowledge that as a significant concern. I'm going to turn it over to Leanne, who will talk briefly about ORMED. ODE worked with or interviewed several electronic service billing providers and landed on partnering with ORMED. And Leanne will get into ORMED in much more detail.
Hi, everyone. ORMED is a Medicaid billing system, but I wanted to give a little bit of background on the Cascade Technology Alliance, just in case some of you haven't heard of what that is. The Cascade Technology Alliance is an intergovernmental agreement between 4 ESDs, Columbia Gorge ESD, Multnomah ESD, Northwest Regional ESD, and Willamette ESD. And the purpose was to bring these ESDs together and collaborate to offer wider ranges of services, increase buying power, and to provide school districts with enhanced service quality and reduced costs. So there's lots of services that the CTA provides across the state. Some of you may purchase some of those services. Maybe, if you have Synergy, that's a CTA product. That you can have Synergy, but it is one of the CTA products. So I just wanted to give some context to that, so you understand that CTA is kind of an umbrella with lots of different products, and ORMED is one of them. Me and my team, though, we are based out of MESD, just so you guys have the context for that as well. We can go to the next slide, you guys. So ORMED is a web-based fee-for-service Medicaid billing system. where school-based health service providers enter their billing into the system. It's all online, and they enter their direct service logs and documentation into ORMED, and then ORMED then submits that to OHA for reimbursement. The reimbursement goes directly to your school district. It doesn't come back to ORMED in any way. The next slide. We have a couple reimbursement success factors. This is kind of part of what we talk about when we're kind of looking at success for your reimbursement program. Just to kind of reiterate some of the things Eli already said, district support is really important, buy-in from that top administrative level. And then a Medicaid champion is what we like to call them, that person that's really going around and re-emphasizing, talking about Medicaid, the importance of it, and kind of driving that and helping to drive that initiative for staff. A lot of times the questions that we get when we do trainings with our school districts is staff want to know where the reimbursement goes, and there isn't, we don't know exactly what that is district to district, and so we just like to share that with districts to say, your staff want to know what's going on with these reimbursement dollars, and if they know, and they know it's going back into those programs, the more likely they are to if they see the reimbursement and see what's happening, then they kind of get that buy-in engagement on their end as well. The other thing we like to emphasize is accountability, so proper expectations set for providers and consistent follow-up from their supervisors. And we have some reporting in ORMED that helps supervisors to do that. So when you have a conversation with staff, you can say, hey, I'm seeing your billing is looking great, or you haven't done a lot of billing yet. Why is that? How can I help you? That is a great feature of ORMED to be able to help providers kind of manage those caseloads and that kind of thing.
So, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Mm-hmm. The transparency of reimbursement and what does my district do with the Medicaid reimbursement, it really is important. We've seen money reinvested into tools utilized by these licensed staff, OTPT, speech, you know, that allows them to do their job easier or streamline their processes using iPads or different things that were purchased through Medicaid reimbursement. So the more you work with those folks to help streamline that, because you know they have tremendous caseloads and can ease or help with that, they definitely see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a slide that we created just to kind of show in a different way what's required to bill for a student. So when you look at an individual student, they need to be Medicaid eligible. They need to have one or more of the eligible health services on their IEP. The service on the IEP needs to have the service, the frequency and duration of the service, assigned parent consent. And that's for each district has to have consent for that student. And then the provider recommendation, and that's just it's that the medically licensed provider is recommending that service is for that child. So I highlight this because ORMED is able to validate against all these different pieces in order to bill. So if for example, if the student's Medicaid eligible, they have a service on the IEP, they have the provider recommendation and everything, but they don't have the consent, ORMED won't bill it. So kind of going back to the risk factors that Eli was talking about earlier, ORMED is able to provide that an additional safeguard to help ensure that billing doesn't go through that's missing a really critical component, and also highlight it for the staff to say, oh, I need to add that parent consent so my billing can go through. An additional feature of ORMED is related to what Linda was talking about earlier with specialized transportation, where transportation is not able to be billed unless a service on that day has been billed and already paid for. And ORMED ensures that by not billing unless there's a paid and billed and paid service on that specific date. So there's never going to be an issue where transportation is billed before that service on that date is billed. So it's again, an additional safeguard to make sure that it's validating against those right components. That's something that ORMED is able to do. You can go to the next slide. So I pulled up, I just kind of brought up a couple different features that that are particularly helpful. There's secure login for each user. So a user can be either a district level administrator or the actual medically licensed provider that's entering their billing. So they have a secure login for each staff. We also have an electronic signature policy. So staff are able to electronically sign their log. So there's no written documentation that's required for that. The policy essentially says that when they click sign on their logs, that the provider is essentially signing that log is ready for billing. We have student caseload management screens and tools. So providers build their caseloads and it shows on their caseload screen if the student is eligible, if there's a consent there or not, their Medicaid information, just information that they need kind of at a glance on their caseload screen. We also check student Medicaid eligibility through the MMIS system, which is OHA's Medicaid eligibility check system. We also do student information uploads. So this is student information as well as IEP information. Currently, we only do this through Synergy and ORSPED, but we are talking with Eli about potentially adding an additional service that to kind of make that service wider ranging for districts that aren't just using Synergy or ORSPED. But we also do have manual student entry and IEP entry. We also have simple log entry, log documentation, so it's tracking the date of service, ICD-10 codes, procedure codes, build minutes, log descriptions, and electronic signature, which is all requirements of the of billing. We also have a parent consent entry, so putting in the date of parent consent to make sure that that's on file for when the date of service is. We have recommendation entry, and then, like I mentioned earlier, validation. So validating against all those appropriate pieces of documentation to make sure that you have everything in place prior to billing. I talked a little bit about transportation validation, so the requirement that a direct service needs to be billed and paid prior to transportation being billed. And then we have a variety of reports such as tracking licensed staff billing, district billing and payments by students, and a couple of other different reports. And we have the ability to create different reports. So I foresee with the pilot districts working together to say, with Eli and with Linda, to say what other reports would be helpful, so we can pull data out that will be helpful for you as a district, but also for the legislature. So we don't, manually putting all this data together. We're able to pull a report that's going to be helpful for all the different stakeholders. What's that? Did I say slow down? Is that what I heard? Sorry. So for training support, we have ORMED specialized staff that help with training and with just general questions and support for your billing, for your providers. We do custom training planning and preparation support. So when we're going to be rolling out to a district, we work with you directly to say how will this training best land with this particular group of providers. We have a variety of training videos that are in ORMED, in-person training options as well as virtual training options, and we have an ORMED user guide that helps providers enter their billing. And like I mentioned, we have knowledgeable support staff to answer questions year-round, and they get to know your providers very well, and they're happy to help however they can. For ORMED pricing, so one thing that Eli and I have talked about is that this is a how have you described that this is that there's fees related to ORMED, but not related to being part of the pilot. So there's no cost to be part of the pilot program, but there will be fees associated with ORMED to provide the service. So just to clarify what those fees are, there's one-time setup fees. And I'll go through that in a moment, what those are. We have ongoing fees based on what your district will bill, and we invoice districts 2 to 4 times per year. And we make sure that we do that within the fiscal year, to make sure that we send invoices that are inclusive of the fiscal year. So the current 17-18 pricing, the one-time fees are a setup fee for each district, so that's just a straight $50. And then we charge per student and per user, and that's for establishing setup with the student information system, adding providers to make sure that everything's set up correctly with their credentials, with their user information, and that also includes training. So that's just a one-time fee, and then the ongoing fees are based on per unit of service, which we consider a 15-minute increment. So what we do is we take the minutes billed in a particular time frame, divide that by 15, and that gives us the 15-minute increment, and that's what we bill. So it's really we invoice districts based on what you're billing. And then transportation is costed out slightly differently at 80 cents each way. So that's one other thing that when you're kind of thinking through how much this might cost for you, since it is based on what your billing will be, and you don't necessarily know what that is at this point. What we generally like to say is that we will never invoice more than 10% of your reimbursement. We're not billing you in that way. We're billing you based on actuals. But if you're thinking about how much of my reimbursement is going to be spent on ORMED fees, it will never be more than 10%. And typically it's not 10% when I've done my analysis. So just for your budgeting and kind of, again, the cost benefit analysis that you're doing as a district, that's what we can commit to. That's our program goal.
I would add, and Linda can speak a little bit more to this, or both of you guys, that once a district is billing, these costs also get built into the prior year annual audited costs, and so it gets added into the cost of billing Medicaid, which then goes towards the amount that you can be next year's cost and how much you can reimburse. And gets reimbursed.
So essentially, whatever ORMED bills a district in a fiscal year can be included in the cost calculation to come up with the rate for the next year. Is that? But
it has to be by category of service.
Right.
So where you show $20 per user for, let's just take the one-time fee, that $20 per OT, for PT, speech, RN, all of that. That would be aligned with the license, with the service and the category of service that's on the IEP.
Okay.
So when schools develop their costs, it's an hourly cost rate based on, is it OT, is it PT, is it speech, that sort of thing. And so if you can do the ongoing fees based on the modifiers that are required in order to bill Medicaid, then that would separate the cost for all of the services billed by category of service. So when the school district develops their hourly cost rate the following year, it'll all align. And then that's how you would get that cost built into your prior year audited costs for the next year.
I think that's something we can definitely support districts to do. We can give you information in that way, especially for this first year, because you're going to have these one-time fees. Where ongoing, in future years you won't. But we can help, the pilot districts understand how to include those when they're doing their costs. So.
Thank you. So that's it for our slides. I have a couple questions that have come in via the chat window, and then I'll open it up for those who are on the phone if they have additional questions. And the first question is from Margot Lalak, and I'm not understanding the full question, Margot. It says, is the recipient the eligible student? The amount is the reimbursed claims eligible student. Can you provide context if you're on the phone?
Yeah, can you hear me right now?
I can.
You can, great. Yeah, I'm on my computer. So there was a slide during the presentation where it referred to recipients and the amount of reimbursement, and under that it was raw numbers. And so, and the first column was the total amount of reimbursement. And so I just wanted to be clear that we're talking about the recipients are the students, and the dollar amount is the amount of reimbursement in total. Does that make sense?
That's under the top health services slide.
Correct. So
Right.
the recipient count is the total number of students that were billed under that for that service.
Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify.
The amount is the total, and this is our state numbers, the total amount for that service.
Yeah, great, thanks.
So in general, the higher the amount, the more numbers of folks that were billed for, but not necessarily, because the cost for a student is really related to the services that they're receiving. And then we had a second question related to transportation. And we'll get to that. And so this has come up before. In Oregon, transportation is, districts are able to receive 70% of their transportation costs from a carve out of the state school fund. And that is separate from this. Medicaid reimbursement is, again, for specialized transportation as identified on a student's IEP. Medicaid's first payer, and so is reimbursed at the Medicaid rate. However, districts can also receive the 70% reimbursement. In conversations with folks in transportation, the intention of the fund, the way it was set up, was that that Medicaid be billed prior, and then that 70% would be applied to when we estimate the 60-40 state match and reimbursement. That 40% of state match would then could be applied for that 70% reimbursement from the state fund. And ideally, and the more we look into it, Medicaid should be billed first as first payer, and for those students who are eligible with specialized transportation, and then the remaining amount be reimbursed from the state transportation fund. I have one other question that came in, I believe. So the question is, if the student is enrolled in a district and MESD nurses provide a billable service, does the district get the reimbursement, or does MESD? So as we've looked at this issue, it really, the district is the one that should be billing for that service and receiving that reimbursement. I know in some cases ESDs are billing on the behalf, but that funding should be tied back to that individual student based on the services that they're receiving as written in their IEP. Right.
So we can get confused when we talk about billing versus being a submitter. So a school district that is has the ultimate responsibility of the IDEA service to the child, if they were to contract a service to be provided, that school district would be enrolled with Medicaid as an enrolled school medical provider, even though the ESD nurse may be providing the service. The school district billing could go through the ESD as a submitter using the school district's number, so that the state share is paid by the school district and the reimbursement goes to the school district. So it can get confusing, and I believe that it has been confusing over the years, and that's something that is being looked at with the Department of Ed and the Oregon Health Authority.
I think an important thing to remember as it relates to school districts and ESDs and the provision of IDEA services and guarantee of FAPE is that that's a responsibility of a school district, and that cannot be given away. The school district remains responsible for that child's IEP, regardless of who they contract or receive services from. And so ultimately, the Medicaid billing comes down to what is identified and required based for that child to access their education, and is dependent upon that responsibility. I hope that answers that's all the questions I'm seeing come through. Oh, there's a new one around high cost disability. Will this affect the amount we can claim for high cost disability? So similar to transportation, over the years we've and most recently we've added to the high cost disability fund. For those who aren't familiar with it, the high cost disability fund is a similar carve-out that allows for districts to apply for reimbursement for students who are the highest cost, high cost disability. And so generally, I want to say it's roughly 60 cents, maybe a little less on the dollar that districts can receive in reimbursement. It's based on the amount of applications received by districts every year. So, and the count is exhausted every year. Similar to transportation, Medicaid is first payer in schools, and the intent is that Medicaid, when eligible, when a student is eligible, that Medicaid be billed and reimbursed for that. There's I believe it's a $30,000 threshold that districts need to meet before applying to the high cost disability. And so in that sense, it may take longer for a district to reach that threshold to then be reimbursed at that, at whatever rate is available for that year. However, as they provide those services, they are being reimbursed, I would say closer to more in real time rather than at the end of the year, and it's based on an amount that is known ahead of time rather than at the end of the year when we're calculating who has applied and how much money is left to divvy up.
First.
One of the things that has been brought up in the conversation with the legislature as well as other stakeholders is the more districts can bring down in Medicaid reimbursement, both as it relates to transportation as well as it relates to high cost disability, the more funding will be made available in general in the state school fund. So we're looking at and hoping for a decreased reliance on those funds as we support districts in bringing in additional Medicaid reimbursement.
And I think a lot of that's due to the fact that IDEA is required for any eligible child, whether they're Medicaid or not. So you're serving them whether they're Medicaid or not. And by billing those Medicaid eligibles first, it reserves those funds for those who are not.
So as the dependency, both the high transportation and high cost disability funds, as those have increased, we're getting and especially since now that there's a conversation around Medicaid and looking at how Oregon is pulling down Medicaid reimbursement, we're getting continued questions and requests related to how to better capitalize on Medicaid because there's ever continued increased reliance on those funds. So that's it for the questions that have come over the chat box. Are there any questions left for those on the phone? As you can see on the screen, my contact information is up. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you have questions or concerns. Hopefully, and I'm also happy to set up a time to visit your site and meet with you in person, as is Linda and Leanne as well. So I appreciate your time today. We will post a recording of the webinar on our school health services website of ODE. And in addition to that, I'll also post links to some of the information that Linda mentioned related to current billing levels, as well as the FMAP rate and so on. Thank you very much for your time today.